I am Claire, 30 years old, and I work as a software engineer. For as long as I can remember, our family house in Burlington, Vermont had been the one place that grounded me. It was more than a building of wood and stone. Every corner held my sweat, my money, and my hope. When my parents struggled, I became the one who patched the cracks, both in the walls and in our lives. That house was my anchor, my dream, my safety. Then one night, everything shattered. We were sitting around the dinner table, a quiet evening that turned into a storm. My mother's fork struck the table with such force it rang like a gavel. She looked at me with eyes that carried no warmth. "You have 2 days to gather your things," she said. Her voice wasn't shaky, it was sharp, final, like a judge handing down a sentence. "This house belongs to your sister now." I stared, frozen in disbelief. My father, sitting silently beside her, kept his eyes on his plate, as though he was carved from stone. And my sister, who had lived across the country in California, barely calling, barely caring, suddenly sat smug with ownership written across her face. For a moment I couldn't breathe. That house, the one I had rescued, the one I had paid for when the bank threatened foreclosure, was being taken away from me in an instant. I had carried its weight, scrubbed its floors, fixed its broken stairs, poured more than $80,000 into its survival. Yet the one who gave nothing was handed everything. The walls seemed to close in. The air thickened, and my heart pounded so loudly, I wondered if they could hear it. I wanted to shout, to remind them of every sacrifice, but I knew it would be useless. Their decision had already been carved in stone. Without another word, I stood from the table. My legs trembled, but my resolve was harder than it had ever been. I walked to my room, closed the door behind me, and gripped my phone. They believed I would simply walk away, defeated, but they were wrong. In 2 days, when my sister stepped into what she thought was her new home, she would regret underestimating me. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling every memory of the house flash before me like scenes on a screen. The laughter of my childhood, the nights I painted walls to cover cracks, the warmth I tried to keep alive. They thought they could erase me from it all. I was determined to show them otherwise. Morning came, but the heaviness didn't leave. The sun filtered through the curtains of the room I had painted myself. The same curtains I had chosen after long hours of overtime shifts. Every detail whispered of my effort, of my care. I thought back to the time 5 years ago when my parents' finances crumbled. The bank had called, warning foreclosure. My father had sat with his head buried in his hands, papers scattered on the table. My mother's voice had broken as she said, "We're going to lose everything." I couldn't let that happen. I had stepped in without hesitation. My savings emptied, my nights filled with extra work. Over the course of 3 years, I paid $80,000 toward the mortgage. Every check I wrote was meant to protect the family, protect the house. Their faces back then had lit with relief, and I told myself it was worth it. But last night proved I had been wrong. My sacrifices were disposable in their eyes. As I stood in the living room that morning, I looked at the beige walls I had painted, the sofa I had saved months to buy, the floorboards I had replaced. It wasn't just furniture and paint. It was proof of my devotion, my loyalty. And yet, it was all being dismissed as though it never mattered. I clenched my fists, my chest burning with betrayal. My sister had done nothing, had offered no hand in times of need. And still, she was rewarded. But I would not give her the satisfaction of enjoying what I had built. I sat down at my desk, powered on my laptop, and began to plan. The anger that had once threatened to suffocate me turned into something sharper, colder, more controlled. They thought they were pushing me out. They had no idea what I was capable of. I reached for my phone and called the only person I knew I could trust with this storm. Elena had been my closest friend since our days at the University of Vermont. She had always been the voice of reason, the one who grounded me when the world spun too fast. Now she was a lawyer, with a sharp mind and a heart that balanced empathy with strength. When she answered, her voice carried the calm steadiness I needed. I told her everything: the clang of my mother's fork, the cold nod from my father, the smug entitlement on my sister's face. I poured out the years of sacrifice, the money I had poured into that house, the nights I had spent working late to keep us afloat. Elena listened quietly, never interrupting, only letting me feel the weight of my own words as I spoke. When I finally stopped, my voice raw, she asked a single question. "Do you have any paperwork? Anything tying you directly to that house?" The question stunned me. "I paid the mortgage," I said. "I have bank statements, receipts, everything." "That helps," she said, her voice shifting into the crisp rhythm of business. "But I'm not talking about bills, I'm talking about ownership. Do you know if your grandfather left a will?" The thought of my grandfather hit me like a wave. He had passed only 2 years earlier. But I could still picture his weathered hands, the way he sat on the porch with me when I was a child, telling stories about building the house himself. He had always made me feel like I was a part of its bones. I remembered his voice as he once said, "Claire, this place will always be yours." I had smiled then, assuming it was only his way of making me feel special. Now I wasn't so sure. "I don't know," I admitted. "I always thought it went straight to my parents." "Give me an hour," Elena said. "I'll find out." The silence that followed her hang-up was unbearable. I paced through the house, each step a reminder of what I stood to lose. I opened an old box of photos, and held one of my grandfather standing beside me under the oak tree in the front yard. His arm was around me, his eyes crinkling with warmth. My throat tightened. How could my parents dismiss everything he had meant to me? When Elena finally called back, her voice carried urgency. "Claire, you're not going to believe this." I spoke with a colleague in estate law and checked the county clerk's office. "Your grandfather's will was filed 3 years before he passed. And Claire, it leaves the house to you. Solely to you." I sank onto the bed, my hands trembling as the truth hit me. "To me? Yes. Not to your parents, not to your sister, to you. They knew, Claire. They must have known, and they hid it." My chest burned with betrayal. My parents had watched me pour $80,000 into this home, repair every corner, make it a place of safety, all while knowing my grandfather had chosen me as heir. And instead of honoring his wish, they conspired to hand it over to my sister. The betrayal was sharp enough to take my breath away. I remembered the long phone calls my mother shared with my sister, the pride my father expressed about her California job, the dismissive tone whenever I mentioned my own sacrifices. The truth was laid bare now. They had favored her all along, and they had tried to erase me from my own inheritance. "Elena," I whispered, "I can't believe it. How could they do this?" Her voice softened. "Because they thought you would never fight back. But you can. The will is ironclad. We can file a claim to enforce it. You have every right to that house." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. For the first time since that dinner, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. My parents had lied, my sister had schemed, but my grandfather had trusted me. His belief in me was written in legal ink, and they could not erase it. I pulled out a notebook and began to list every document I had: bank records, receipts, proof of every dollar I had spent. Each item was more than evidence. It was a piece of my devotion. By the time I closed the notebook, my fear had given way to something far stronger: determination. They thought I would crumble. Instead, I was ready to fight for what was mine. The following morning, the house felt both familiar and foreign. I woke early, the silence pressing against me like an uninvited guest. My parents had gone to visit friends in Montpelier, leaving me in the very house they had tried to steal from me. For the first time, I walked through the rooms not just as their daughter but as the rightful owner. Every nail, every paint stroke, every dollar I had invested was proof of my bond to the place. I stood in the living room, staring at the sofa I had bought with my first big paycheck. A soft gray piece. It had taken me months of overtime to afford. My hand brushed over its cushions, and I felt the anger rise again. If my sister thought she could just waltz in and enjoy what I had worked so hard to create, she was mistaken. I grabbed a pen and paper, sat at the dining table, and began to list everything in the house that I had purchased. The flat-screen television, the stainless steel washer in the basement, the curtains I had chosen to match the beige paint, the chairs I had replaced after my mother complained about the old ones. Item by item, I marked them, my handwriting steady with resolve. These were mine. If they wanted me gone, I would not leave my belongings behind. I called Elena to update her. She was already at her office, her tone brisk. "We'll file to enforce the will, but in the meantime, document everything. Get an affidavit notarized to prove your financial contributions. The more evidence you have, the stronger your case." "I have boxes of receipts," I told her. "Good," she replied. "Keep them safe, we'll use everyone." Hanging up, I felt lighter. I had a plan, and that plan gave me strength. But I also had another task ahead. If my sister was arriving soon, she wouldn't find a furnished home waiting for her. I searched online for a moving company in Burlington and found Green Mountain Movers. Their reviews were solid, and I dialed their number with confidence. A man named Tom answered, his voice rough but kind. "I need a rush job," I explained. "Can you send a crew today?" He hesitated, but after I pressed, he agreed. "We'll be there by noon," he said. I gave him the list of items I wanted moved. "This is personal property," I told him firmly. "I'm taking what belongs to me." As the morning ticked by, I moved through the house, tagging each item with sticky notes. The process was strangely calming. For once, I wasn't acting out of desperation but control. Each note I placed was like reclaiming a piece of myself. Around 10, the doorbell rang. I opened it to see Mrs. Linda, our neighbor from across the street. She had always been kind, bringing cookies at Christmas and checking in during storms. She looked at me with concern. "Are you all right, Claire?" she asked softly. I forced a smile. "I'm moving a few things out." She studied me for a moment, then squeezed my arm. "You've always been good to this house. Whatever's going on, you don't deserve this." Her words brought a sting of tears, but I held them back. "Thank you," I whispered. Not long after, Mr. Williams stopped by. His boots were still dusty from work, his face lined with years of knowing my grandfather. "He loved this place," he said, glancing around. "And I know he'd be proud of how you've cared for it." I nodded, unable to speak. Their kindness was like a lifeline, reminding me I wasn't completely alone. By noon, the movers arrived. 3 men in a white truck worked quickly, carrying out the sofa, wrapping the washer in blankets, securing the television. I guided them through the house, pointing out the tagged items. Watching them carry out my belongings was bittersweet. It felt like I was dismantling pieces of my life, but at the same time, I knew it was right. These things were mine, and I wouldn't let them fall into my sister's hands. Elena called again, reminding me to keep every receipt, even for the movers. "This strengthens your case," she said. When the last box was loaded, the house echoed with emptiness. But instead of weakness, I felt power. My family thought they could erase me from this place, but I was showing them otherwise. By mid-afternoon, the house felt hollow, the rooms stripped of the warmth I had once poured into them. The echo of my footsteps on the bare floorboards made it clear this was no longer a home, at least not in the way it had been. Yet that emptiness was also a declaration. I would not let my sister inherit my sacrifices along with the keys. The sharp knock on the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I opened it to find her standing there, suitcase at her feet, eyes narrowed as though the house already belonged to her. Teresa. She had flown in from California, dressed in a sleek blazer, her posture dripping with confidence. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking across the hardwood. "Where's everything?" she demanded, scanning the bare living room, her voice sharp with entitlement. I crossed my arms, staying by the door. "I took what was mine." She spun to face me, her expression shifting from confusion to outrage. "Yours? Mom and Dad said this house is mine now, you don't get to strip it bare." Her words were like salt in a wound, but my voice remained steady. "The sofa, the television, the washer, every single thing I removed, I paid for. You never contributed a dime. If you want a furnished house, buy your own furniture." Her face flushed red. "You think you're entitled because you threw some money around? This is my home now, you're out." The arrogance in her tone ignited something in me. I stepped forward, my voice cold. "You haven't been here in years, Teresa. I kept this house standing while you lived across the country, ignoring us. You don't get to dismiss what I've done." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Oh, please. You stayed here because you had nothing better to do. Playing the role of the good daughter while I was actually building a career. Mom and Dad chose me for a reason." The words cut, but I didn't flinch. "They chose wrong." Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Mom and Dad. They'll deal with you." I shrugged, leaning against the wall. "Go ahead. They're not here." Her brow furrowed, but she pressed the phone to her ear anyway, pacing the kitchen while her voice rose in outrage. "She gutted the place, Mom. It's empty." I stood in silence, letting her rant, my arms folded. She hung up, glaring at me with venom. "They're coming back tonight. You're finished, Claire." I held her gaze and pointed to the door. "You know where the exit island." For a moment she stood frozen, her chest heaving. Then she grabbed her suitcase, muttered something under her breath, and stormed out. The slam of the door rattled the frame, but I didn't move. My heart pounded, but my resolve was steady. She thought she could walk in and claim everything I had built. She had no idea what was already in motion. That evening, I carried what remained of my belongings to Elena's apartment downtown. My things were safe now, tucked into a nearby storage unit. The silence of my phone didn't last long, call after call from my mother, her name flashing across the screen. I ignored them until her voice finally filled my voicemail. "Claire, what have you done? There's a stranger in our house. Some man says he owns it now. Explain yourself." When I finally picked up one of my father's calls, his voice thundered with disbelief. "We were protecting the family. You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, my tone colder than I thought possible. "You weren't protecting the family. You were protecting Teresa. Grandfather's will was clear. The house was mine. You chose to hide it." He sputtered, trying to find words, but I didn't wait. I ended the call, my hand trembling only slightly. Minutes later, my mother tried again. Her tone carried both anger and desperation. "Claire, you're tearing us apart. Come fix this." I drew in a breath. "I'm done fixing your mistakes. Talk to Elena about the will." Then I hung up and silenced my phone. Elena sat across from me, her laptop open, papers spread out. "They're panicking," she said, her eyes sharp. "The new owner has the deed. They can't undo this now." I nodded slowly, sipping coffee to steady myself. The house I had poured myself into was gone, not because I wanted it sold, but because their betrayal had forced my hand. The ache of loss sat heavy in my chest. Yet there was also relief. For the first time in years, the chains of obligation had broken. The days that followed were heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional voicemail from my parents. I didn't answer. Each message carried the same mixture of anger, pleading, and disbelief. "We're your family," my mother cried in one. "You can't do this to us." In another, my father's voice cracked with something between rage and despair. "You've destroyed everything." But the truth was clearer to me than it had ever been. I wasn't the one who had broken trust. They were. At Elena's apartment, I sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers, receipts, and copies of my grandfather's will. She was methodical, guiding me through every step. The sale of the house had gone through legally, the new owner had the deed, and my parents' attempt to contest it had already been rejected. There was nothing more they could do. "You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for," Elena said one evening as we closed the files. Her eyes held the kind of steady pride I had craved my whole life from my parents. I swallowed hard. "It doesn't feel like strength, it feels like survival." "Sometimes they're the same thing," she replied. In the weeks that followed, I adjusted to life without the house that had once defined me. I rented a small apartment in Burlington, sunlight pouring through its modest windows. At first the quiet was suffocating. I missed the creak of the stairs I had repaired, the familiar hum of the old refrigerator, even the smell of the wood floors I had polished countless times. But gradually, the silence became freedom. I no longer carried the weight of my parents' demands or the constant reminder of their betrayal. My days settled into a new rhythm. I started a position at a small marketing firm, downtown, far from the world of coding that had once drained me. The work was fresh, collaborative, and surprisingly fulfilling. My coworkers valued my ideas, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something that was mine alone. Evenings were spent arranging the furniture I had fought to keep: the gray sofa, the television, the chairs I had purchased. Each item carried the weight of old battles. But here in my new space, they symbolized resilience instead of loss. I placed photographs of my grandfather on a shelf, his steady smile a reminder of the faith he had placed in me. His will had not only given me legal rights, it had given me the strength to stand up for myself. News of my family trickled in through mutual acquaintances. My sister had scrambled to purchase her own house back in California, dipping into savings she hadn't planned to touch. The life she thought she would inherit freely had cost her dearly. I didn't gloat, but there was a certain justice in knowing she had learned the price of entitlement. As for my parents, They had moved into a small rental on the outskirts of town. Neighbors who once admired them now whispered disappointment, their reputations tarnished by the truth that had come to light. Without the property to lean on, and with mounting legal fees from their failed challenges, they struggled financially. I kept my distance, refusing to pick up the burden they had so willingly dropped on me for years. At times the weight of estrangement pressed on me. I would walk by the lakefront, the breeze cool against my face, and wonder if I had done the right thing. But then I remembered the moment my mother slammed her fork against the table, dismissing everything I had sacrificed. I remembered the silence of my father, the mocking entitlement in Teresa's voice. And I knew the truth. Cutting ties wasn't about anger, it was about peace. For too long I had given everything to a family that only took. I had poured myself into a house they had tried to take away. In losing it, I discovered something greater, myself. Now, when I walked through the streets of Burlington, I didn't feel the heavy pull of betrayal. I felt lighter, freer. The life I was building wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Built on my terms, with my strength, and with a resolve I hadn't known I possessed until I was forced to fight for it. Months turned into seasons, and the rhythm of my new life carried me forward. The pain of betrayal dulled, though it never fully disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, I would catch myself replaying the dinner when my mother's fork struck the table, the look of silent complicity on my father's face, the smug curl of Teresa's smile. It still stung. But the sting reminded me of the line I had drawn, the one I would never allow them to cross again. My apartment began to feel like home. I painted the walls in soft tones that made the rooms glow with warmth. I set up my gray sofa near the window where the sun streamed in during the afternoons, and I placed a rug beneath it that made the space cozy. Each choice was mine alone, not an obligation to appease anyone else. For the first time, the house I lived in was a reflection of me and only me. At work, I thrived. The marketing firm was small but vibrant, filled with people who encouraged creativity and collaboration. I was no longer just a cog in the wheel of endless software code. I was part of a team that valued my ideas, and that validation healed wounds I hadn't even realized were so deep. Coffee breaks with colleagues turned into friendships, and brainstorming sessions filled with laughter reminded me that life could be light again. Elena remained my anchor. We met often, sharing coffee or dinner, our conversations weaving between the ordinary and the profound. She never let me forget that my strength had carried me through, but she also reminded me that it was okay to rest now. "You don't have to fight every day," she said one evening as we sat in her apartment, the city lights glowing outside the window. "Sometimes surviving is enough." I thought about that often. For years, I had been in constant battle mode, fighting to save the house, fighting to support my parents, fighting to hold everything together. Now I was learning to live without the fight, to let life flow without clutching so tightly. Occasionally, whispers of my family's struggles reached me through neighbors or mutual friends. My parents' finances continued to crumble, their reputations stained beyond repair in our close-knit community. The people who once admired them now shook their heads, knowing the truth of how they had hidden my grandfather's wishes. Teresa's glamorous life in California was more fragile than it appeared. The house she bought straining her finances in ways she hadn't expected. I didn't revel in their hardship, but I didn't rescue them either. The old me would have rushed to ease their burdens, to sacrifice again in hopes of earning their approval. The new me knew better. Love should never be measured in dollars or sacrifices demanded. One crisp autumn afternoon, I walked along the lakefront, the water sparkling under the sunlight. Children laughed in the distance, their voices carrying on the breeze. I thought about my grandfather, about his weathered hands and the quiet certainty in his voice when he once told me, "This place will always be yours." At the time, I thought he meant the house. But now, as I stood with the wind in my hair and the weight lifted from my shoulders, I realized he had meant something deeper. He had meant my sense of belonging, my right to claim a life of my own. The house had been a symbol, but it wasn't the core of his promise. I paused to breathe in the cool air, and for the first time, I felt peace without conditions. I no longer measured my worth by the approval of parents who had betrayed me or the presence of a sister who had dismissed me. I measured it in the freedom I had carved for myself, in the choices I now owned completely. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. And that was enough.